You ever try unlocking your own front door and realize someone else decided you don't belong there anymore? The key felt wrong the second it touched the metal. A dull scrape instead of that clean, familiar click like the house itself was rejecting me. And when I looked closer, the cylinder was brand new, polished chrome catching the late afternoon sun like a signal, not to welcome me home, but to warn me off. And that's when I saw the paper taped just above the handle, edges perfectly aligned. HOA letterhead bold and confident. The kind of paper that smells like fresh toner and bad decisions. Unauthorized property modifications. Access restricted until compliance. Signed by Victoria Hayes, neat cursive, no hesitation, like she truly believed she owned the threshold I'd walked through every single day for the past 3 years. And for a second, just 1 second, I stood there on my own porch, gravel crunching under my boots, feeling that quiet pressure build behind my ribs. Not anger. Not yet, just something colder. Something that measured instead of reacted. Because here's the thing. They didn't know about me. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I don't just fix things, I design access control systems, the kind banks trust when millions of dollars sit behind steel doors thicker than your hand, the kind of systems where one mistake doesn't just cost money, it rewrites who has power. And standing there with that useless key in my hand, I could already hear the echo of a vault door sealing shut. Heavy, final, absolute. But I didn't force the lock, didn't call a locksmith, didn't even knock. Instead, I stepped back, slow, deliberate, and looked at the entire frame, the hinges, the strike plate, the cheap materials they thought were enough to keep me out. And I smiled just a little because this wasn't about getting inside anymore. This was about teaching someone exactly what access denied really means. And as the evening air cooled and the smell of cut grass drifted down the street, I pulled out my phone, not to complain, not to argue, but to take pictures. Every angle, every detail, the new hardware, the notice, the timestamp glowing in the corner of the screen. Documentation beats emotion every time, my old mentor used to say, and I could almost hear his voice as I zoomed in on Victoria's signature, crisp, confident, completely unaware of what she just set in motion. Because people like her think control is a piece of paper, a rule, a signature at the bottom of a form, but real control, the kind that lasts, the kind that holds, is built out of steel and patience and knowing exactly when not to act. And that night, I didn't sleep much, not because I was worried, but because my mind was already assembling something bigger, heavier, something that wouldn't just replace a lock, it would redefine the door itself. Measurements ran through my head like blueprints, inches turning into tolerances, tolerances into pressure ratings. I could feel the weight of it before it even existed, hear the deep, solid thud it would make when it closed, the kind of sound that doesn't ask for permission. It declares finality, and somewhere across the neighborhood, I imagine Victoria Hayes pouring herself a glass of wine, convinced she'd solved a problem, convinced she'd put me in my place. And that's when I realized the funniest part of all of this. She thought she locked me out, but she had no idea she'd just given me the perfect reason to make sure no one ever controlled that door again. The next morning smelled like cold steel and burnt coffee, the kind of air that sticks in your throat and reminds you nothing is normal anymore. I did not even bother walking up to the front door this time because I already knew what I would see, that same polished lock catching the early light like it owned the place. So I circled the house instead, boots pressing into the damp grass, every step slow, deliberate, mapping my own property like a surveyor reclaiming lost ground, because if they wanted to play control, I was going to understand every inch of what they thought they had taken. And that is when I noticed something small but important. The back gate latch had been tampered with too, not replaced, just loosened, like someone had tested boundaries and decided the front door was enough to send a message. And that told me everything I needed to know about how they operated, bold where it looked official, sloppy where they thought nobody would check. And I crouched down, fingers brushing the metal, feeling the slight misalignment, the cheap hardware they used, the shortcuts, the assumptions, and I could not help it. I let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because people like Victoria Hayes do not understand systems. They understand appearances, and appearances are easy to fake until someone who actually builds the system shows up. And I stood there for a moment, looking at my own backyard like it belonged to someone else, the fence line, the shed, the concrete slab where I had once set up a small workbench. All still mine, legally, physically, undeniably mine, even if that front door said otherwise. And that was the flaw, the gap in their logic. They thought a lock defined ownership, but a lock is just a component, a single point in a much larger system. And I designed systems, not just parts, and as the sun climbed higher, warming the side of the house, I pulled out my phone again, not to take pictures this time, but to make calls, suppliers, contacts, people who owed me favors from jobs done right and on time. I spoke in measurements, in materials, in timelines, no emotion, just specifications, steel gauge, hinge load ratings, bolt depth, frame reinforcement. Each detail clicking into place like pieces of a blueprint that had been waiting for a reason to exist. And by the time I hung up the last call, I could already see in my mind, not just a door, something heavier, something final, something that would not just resist interference, but eliminate it entirely. And that is when my neighbor across the street stepped out, Mr. Dalton, retired, always watching everything without looking like he was watching anything. He gave me that slow nod people give when they know something is off, but do not want to say it out loud. Trouble with the HOA? He asked, voice low, careful, like he did not want it to carry. And I just held up the useless key between my fingers, letting the sunlight hit it, letting the silence answer for me. And he shook his head, not surprised, just disappointed, like he had seen this kind of thing before. They push until someone pushes back, he said. And then he went back inside like that was all that needed to be said. And maybe it was because as I stood there, the weight of that sentence settled in, not as a warning, but as confirmation. And I looked back at the house, at that door they thought they controlled. And I realized something else. This was never about getting inside quickly. This was about making sure that once I did, nobody would ever decide again whether I belonged there. And the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of asphalt from somewhere down the street. Construction, progress, change, all the things people pretend are harmless until they happen to them. And I turned toward my truck, already knowing the next step. Not anger, not confrontation, just execution, precise, measured, inevitable, because they changed a lock and they thought that was the end of it. But for me, that was just the beginning of something they would not be able to undo. By noon, the driveway sounded different. Not quiet suburban silence anymore, but the low rumble of delivery trucks and the sharp metallic clank of steel being offloaded, each impact echoing through the neighborhood like a warning bell nobody could quite place. And I stood there with a tape measure in one hand and a notepad in the other, writing numbers that actually mattered: frame width, wall depth, hinge clearance, real measurements. Not the decorative nonsense printed in HOA guidelines. Because what I was building did not care about aesthetics, it cared about permanence. And as the first pallet hit the ground, the smell of machine oil and raw metal filled the air, clean, heavy, honest, nothing like the synthetic perfume that followed Victoria haze around like a cloud of authority she did not earn. And I could feel eyes on me, curtains shifting, neighbors pretending to check their mail just a little longer than usual. Because this was not normal, not for this neighborhood, where everything is beige and predictable and controlled. And that is exactly why I did not rush. Every movement slow, deliberate, like I had all the time in the world, because in a way I did. Patience is part of the system, and systems are what I build, not reactions, not arguments, systems that outlast whoever tries to interfere with them. And I started with the frame because that is where real strength lives, not in the lock itself, but in what holds it. Anchoring steel into concrete, drilling deeper than necessary, making sure that once it was set, it would not shift, not warp, not give, and each drill bit sang against the material, a high-pitched whine that cut through the afternoon heat, sweat running down my neck, mixing with the fine dust that clung to everything. And I welcomed it because this was work that meant something, not paperwork, not complaints, not signatures on a page, but something real, something measurable. And halfway through setting the lower anchors, I heard the soft crunch of tires on gravel behind me, slow, controlled, deliberate. And I did not even need to turn around to know who it was. The engine idled too smoothly, too quietly, expensive, calculated. And when I finally looked over my shoulder, there she was, Victoria Hayes, stepping out like she owned the ground she walked on, sunglasses perfectly placed, posture straight, every movement rehearsed like she had practiced this moment in her head, expecting resistance, expecting noise, expecting me to argue. And I gave her none of it, just a glance, calm, neutral, then back to my work like she was just another background sound. And that threw her off more than any words ever could. I could feel it in the pause, the slight hesitation before she spoke. "Mr. Caldwell, I believe you received our notice." Her voice smooth, controlled, carrying that artificial sweetness that tries to pass as authority, and I tightened another bolt, the ratchet clicking with a steady rhythm before I answered. "I did." Simple, flat, no emotion, and the silence stretched just long enough to make her uncomfortable, because she was waiting for a reaction that was not coming. And when she looked past me, really looked this time, at the steel, at the reinforced plates, at the depth of what was already in place, I saw it just for a second, that crack in her certainty, that moment where she realized. This was not a normal response, not something she could manage with another letter or another fine. And she cleared her throat, adjusting her tone. "Any modifications must be approved by the association before installation." And I set the ratchet down, stood up, wiped my hands on a cloth, and finally faced her fully, the weight of the frame behind me, solid, immovable, and I met her gaze without raising my voice, without stepping closer, just steady, measured. "You already made a modification." Without approval. And that was it. No lecture, no escalation, just a fact placed between us like a line she had already crossed. And for a moment, the air felt heavier, like the entire street was holding its breath, waiting to see who would move first. But I did not move. I did not need to, because every bolt I had tightened, every anchor I had set, every inch of steel now embedded into that structure was already speaking for me, louder than any argument ever could. And as she stood there, processing, recalculating, I turned back to the frame and picked up the next piece, because the truth was simple. She thought this was about compliance, about rules, about control, but what she was looking at was something else entirely, something she could not rewrite, something she could not remove, something that once finished would not just keep people out, it would decide who even had the right to try. The sun dipped lower, but the heat stayed trapped in the concrete, radiating up through my boots as I set the final anchor bolts into the base frame, each turn of the wrench slow and exact, metal tightening against metal with that deep, satisfying resistance that tells you something is locked in for good. And behind me, I could still feel her presence. Not close enough to interfere, not far enough to leave, just standing there calculating, watching a system she did not understand come together. Piece by piece, and after a minute the soft tap of her heels shifted, a sign she was trying to regain control of the situation. "This installation is not approved," she said again, sharper this time, less polished, and I let the silence stretch before I answered, because timing matters, neither. Was changing my locks, I said, not turning around, just letting the words sit in the air like weight. And when I finally stood up and faced her again, I saw it clearly now, not just irritation, but uncertainty, the kind that creeps in when authority stops working the way it always has. And she glanced at the structure behind me, really studying it this time, the reinforced steel, the industrial hinges rated for thousands of pounds, the deep-set frame that was already fused into the structure of the house. And I watched her realize something she did not want to admit. This was not cosmetic. This was not reversible. And more importantly, this was not something she could control with a letter or a fine. And her voice shifted again, softer, trying a different angle. "You are creating a safety concern," she said. And that almost made me smile, because safety is the language people use when they are losing leverage. "This door will comply with every structural and fire code requirement," I said, calm, precise, more than what was here before. And she opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, because she did not have the details. She did not have the knowledge. She just had position. And position does not mean much when the other person understands the system better than you do. And for a second, neither of us spoke. Just the sound of a distant lawnmower humming somewhere down the street, and the faint metallic tick of cooling steel as the temperature shifted. And then she tried one more time, stepping slightly closer, careful not to cross any visible boundary. "The association can enforce compliance through legal channels," she said, and I nodded once, slow, acknowledging, not agreeing. "Then you should make sure your last action holds up in court," I said, meeting her eyes, steady, no aggression, just clarity. And that was when the shift happened, subtle but real. Her posture tightened, shoulders pulling back, the performance returning, because she needed to feel in control again. "We will be reviewing this situation," she said, tone clip now official. And I did not respond. I just picked up the next component, a thick steel plate that would become part of the Door assembly, its weight solid in my hands, grounding, real, and I turned away from her completely, ending the conversation without needing to say it out loud, because in systems, actions matter more than words. And as I aligned the plate with the frame, guiding it into position with slow, controlled movements, I could hear her steps retreat across the gravel, each one quieter than the last until the engine of her car started again. Smooth, controlled, and then faded down the street. And the moment she was gone, the air felt different, lighter, like pressure had been released, but I did not relax. Not yet, because this was still the build phase, still the part where everything had to be exact, no shortcuts, no assumptions, and I tightened the bolts one by one, feeling the structure come together under my hands, each connection reinforcing the next. Each piece part of a system that was now larger than any single point of failure. And as the light shifted toward evening, casting long shadows across the yard, I stepped back for the first time and looked at what was already in place. The beginnings of something that did not just resist interference, it eliminated it. And I knew she would be back with paperwork, with threats, maybe even with people who thought they could undo what I was building. But that did not matter anymore, because the moment those first anchors went in, the outcome was already set. Not by emotion, not by argument, but by design, and design, when done right, does not negotiate. The evening settled in slow, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper, every movement more deliberate, and I kept working under a single overhead light I had mounted to the porch, its white beam cutting clean across the steel like a spotlight on something that was never meant to be hidden. The smell of heated metal lingering in the air as I aligned the main door slab with the frame, guiding it inch by inch with a hoist that groaned under the weight, because this was not a standard door. This was over 4 inches thick, layered steel with internal reinforcement, designed to resist pressure, time, and most importantly, interference. And as it swung into place the first time, the hinges took the load without a sound, no creak, no flex, just solid, controlled movement, exactly as intended, and I stepped back slightly, watching how it settled, how it aligned, how the tolerances held tight across every edge. And that is when I heard it. Footsteps again, not just one set this time, multiple, uneven, cautious, like people approaching something they did not fully understand. And I did not need to turn immediately. I already knew this was the next move. Escalation disguised as authority. And when I finally looked over my shoulder, there she was again, Victoria Hayes, but this time she was not alone. 2 men with her, both carrying clipboards, dressed like inspectors, but standing like they were unsure where they actually fit in this situation. And the moment they saw the door fully in place, I caught the shift in their posture, the hesitation, the way their eyes tracked the structure before they even looked at me. Because real materials speak, louder than titles. And Victoria stepped forward first, her voice sharper now, less controlled. "This has gone far enough," she said, and I wiped my hands slowly, setting the cloth down on the workbench, giving her my full attention without rushing, because rushing is what people do when they are reacting, and I was not reacting, I was finishing. "You are in violation of multiple association rules," she continued, holding up a folder like it carried weight, and one of the men beside her cleared, his throat slightly, glancing at the door again before speaking. "We are here to evaluate the installation," his tone careful, neutral, and I nodded once, stepping aside just enough to give them a clear view without inviting them closer, because access is always controlled, even in something as simple as positioning, and they walked forward slowly, shoes scraping lightly against the concrete. One of them reaching out instinctively before stopping himself, like he realized touching it might mean acknowledging something he could not undo, and I watched them take it in, the reinforced frame, the anchor points, the hinge assembly, the locking mechanism housing still open, revealing the internal design, and their expressions shifted from routine inspection to something else, something more cautious, because this was not decorative, this was engineered, and the second man leaned slightly toward the first, whispering something under his breath, too low to catch. But the meaning was clear enough. This was outside their normal script. And Victoria noticed it too. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes moved between them and me, trying to regain control of a conversation that was slipping out of her hands. "This structure is not approved," she said again, louder this time, like volume could replace certainty, and I let a small pause settle before I answered. Approval does not override ownership, I said, calm, measured, and the first man straightened slightly, glancing at her before looking back at me. Do you have documentation for this installation? He asked, and I reached into my truck without breaking eye contact, pulling out a folder of my own, thicker, organized, each page clipped and labeled, permits, material specifications, compliance sheets, everything aligned in a way that left no room for interpretation. And I handed it to him, not aggressively, not defensively, just as a fact. And he took it, flipping through slowly, each page turning with a soft, deliberate sound. And as he read, the silence grew heavier, not tense, just undeniable. Because every line, every number, every certification told the same story. This was not a violation. This was overcompliance, precision taken to a level they did not expect. And I could feel Victoria watching him, waiting for something she could use, some line she could point to, but it did not come. And after a moment, he closed the folder gently, handing it back with a small nod that said more than any words could. And that was the moment the balance shifted completely, because authority without foundation cannot stand for long. And as I took the folder and set it back in my truck, I looked at the door again, now fully seated in its frame, solid, complete, and I knew exactly what would happen next. Not because of guesswork, but because systems follow patterns, and when one path closes, people look for another, but this time there was not going to be another path, not one they could force open, not one they could rewrite, because what stood in front of them now was not just a barrier, it was a statement written in steel, and steel does not negotiate. The night settled deeper, but the work did not stop. The air cooling just enough to make the steel contract with faint ticking sounds like the structure itself was locking into place, and I stood there under that single overhead light with the final component laid out in front of me. The locking core, not something off a hardware store shelf, not something designed for convenience, but a precision system built to control access down to fractions of an inch, every pin, every channel machined to exact tolerances, and as I lifted it into position, the weight felt right, balanced, intentional, like it belonged there all along. And for a moment I paused, looking at the door as a whole, the frame, the anchors, the hinges, all of it now connected into a single system that did not depend on approval, did not depend on interpretation, only on physics and design. And that is when the quiet shifted again. A low hum of an engine pulling up, slower this time, more cautious, and I did not turn. Immediately, because I already understood the pattern, escalation always comes in layers. First authority, then verification, then pressure. And when I finally looked over, it was not Victoria this time, not directly, but the next step she had reached for, a county vehicle, official markings, someone who carried jurisdiction instead of just opinion, and the man who stepped out moved differently, less rehearsed, more grounded, clipboard in hand, but eyes already scanning the structure before he even spoke, taking in the details the others had missed or chosen to ignore, and he approached without rushing, boots steady on the concrete, stopping just outside the threshold like he understood instinctively that boundaries mattered here. Evening, he said, voice neutral, professional, and I gave a small nod back. Evening, keeping it simple because this was not a conversation about feelings, this was about facts, and he looked at the door again, longer this time, tracing the lines of the frame, the depth of the anchors, the exposed sections of the locking system. And I could see it in his eyes, recognition, not of the exact design, but of the intent behind it, the level of work, the precision, and that changed everything because once someone understands what they are looking at, they stop relying on assumptions. Got a call about a structural concern, he said finally, glancing at his notes before looking back up, and I gestured slightly toward the door, not inviting, just indicating all permits and specs are documented. I said, steady, and he stepped closer, not crossing into the doorway, just enough to see clearly, flipping through his clipboard, comparing what he had been told with what was actually in front of him. And the silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional metallic tick from the cooling steel. And after a moment, he exhaled slowly, not frustration, not relief, just acknowledgement. This exceeds standard residential requirements, he said, more to himself than to me, and I nodded once, because that was the point, not to meet expectations, but to go beyond them in a way that left no room for argument. And he turned a page, checking something else, then looked back at me. "You are aware this will draw attention," he added, not as a warning, more like a statement of fact. And I met his gaze evenly. "That already happened," I said. And for a second, there was the smallest hint of smile at the corner of his mouth, like he understood more than he was saying. And he closed his clipboard, tapping it lightly against his palm before stepping back, giving the structure one last look. "For what I can see, there's no violation here," he said, clear, direct. And that was it. No drama, no escalation, just a line drawn in reality that could not be rewritten. And as he turned to leave, the engine of the vehicle starting again in the background, I could feel the shift settle in, not loud, not dramatic, just final, because this was the moment where their leverage disappeared completely. And somewhere down the street, I knew Victoria Hayes was waiting for a different outcome, something she could use, something she could twist, but that was not what she was going to get. And as the vehicle pulled away, the quiet returned, deeper this time, heavier, like the neighborhood itself was adjusting to a new balance. And I turned back to the door, placing my hand on the steel for a brief second, feeling the cool, solid surface under my palm. And I finished the last connection inside the locking mechanism, a precise click echoing softly in. The still air, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because from that moment on, access was no longer something anyone else could decide. It was something that had been engineered, defined, and sealed, and systems like that do not fail, they simply hold. The morning after felt different before I even opened my eyes, the kind of stillness that comes when something irreversible has already happened. And when I stepped onto the porch, the air carried that faint metallic scent again, not from active work this time, but from something finished, settled, holding its ground. And there was in front of me, the door fully assembled, every seam tight, every edge aligned, the surface catching the early light in a way that made it look less like part of a house and more like a boundary drawn in steel. And I reached out and ran my fingers across it, feeling the smooth, cold surface. No give, no weakness, just solid resistance. And for a second, I just stood there listening, because systems have a sound when they're complete, not loud, not obvious, just an absence of movement, an absence of uncertainty. And that is when I heard it, the soft crunch of tires again, but this time faster, less controlled, like someone had run out of patience and decided to act. And when I looked up, Victoria Hayes stepped out of her car before the engine even fully stopped, folder in hand, heels striking the pavement sharper than before, each step carrying frustration she could not hide anymore. And behind her, two more vehicles pulled up, not officials this time, just people she had brought to reinforce her position, neighbors maybe, or board members. Faces tight with curiosity and something else, something closer to unease, because even from a distance, they could see this was not the same situation anymore. And she walked straight up to the door without acknowledging me at first, like if she ignored me long enough, the structure would somehow revert back to something she could manage. And she reached out, hand hovering just a fraction before making contact, like even she understood there was a line she was about to cross. And when her fingers touched the surface, I watched the realization hit, not all at once, but in layers, the weight, the rigidity, the fact that this was not a standard installation, not something you could simply override with authority. And she pulled her hand back quickly, masking it with a shift in posture, turning toward me with that same controlled expression she always used when things were not going her way. "This is excessive," she said, voice tight. And I leaned lightly against the frame, not blocking, not inviting, just present. "It is compliant," I replied, calm. And one of the men behind her stepped closer, glancing between us. "Can it even open?" he asked, half skeptical, half curious. And I looked at him for a second before turning back to the door, placing my hand on the handle, the metal cool under my palm. And I did not rush it. I let the moment stretch, let them all focus on that single point, because this was the part that mattered. Not the build, not the argument, but the result. And then I turned the mechanism. Slowly, a deep, precise engagement inside the door. Not a click, but a layered sequence of movements, internal components aligning exactly as designed. And when I pulled, the door moved, heavy but controlled, swinging open with a quiet authority that filled the space more than any noise could. And for a moment, nobody spoke, because they all felt it, that difference, that shift from something symbolic to something real. And I stepped inside without looking back, crossing the threshold that had been denied to me just days before, and the air inside smelled the same as it always had, familiar, unchanged, because the house had never stopped being mine, only the access had been challenged, and I turned slightly, looking back through the opening at them standing there on the outside. And that was when the roles finally settled into place. No words needed, no argument left to make, just a simple truth reflected in steel and space. I was inside, they were not. And the distance between those two positions was no longer something they could close. And as I reached back and pulled the door shut again, the final sound echoed low and solid, not loud, not dramatic, just complete, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been building from the very first moment that key failed to turn. The sound of that door closing did not fade. It settled, deep and final, like something locking into place not just in steel, but in the space between me and everyone standing outside. And for a moment I stayed still on the inside, hand resting lightly against the surface, feeling the faint vibration die out until there was nothing left but silence. The kind of silence that only exists when a system has done exactly what it was designed to do. And then I turned, walking through my own living room like I had never left. The familiar creak of the floorboards under my boots, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Everything unchanged except for one thing, control. And as I moved through the space, I could hear muffled voices outside. Not clear words, just tones, confusion, frustration, the sound of people trying to figure out what had just happened without admitting they already knew. And I did not rush back to the door, did not engage, because that was no longer necessary. The answer was already there, built into every inch of that structure. And after a few minutes, I walked back toward the entryway, not to confront, just to observe, placing my hand on the internal control lever and pausing, listening, because outside I could hear Victoria's voice more clearly now, sharper, strained. "This is not over," she said, and someone else responded, lower, uncertain, and I let a small breath out through my nose. Not a laugh, just acknowledgement, because of course it was. Not over for her. People like her do not stop when they lose control. They escalate. They look for new angles, new ways to reassert authority. But what they forget is that escalation only works if there is still access to exploit. And I turned the internal mechanism slightly, not opening the door, just engaging the system enough to remind myself of its precision. The way each component aligned perfectly, no slack, no hesitation. And then I stepped back again, letting the moment pass, because there was nothing left for me to prove, not out there, not anymore. And eventually the voices faded, footsteps retreating, engines starting one by one, until the street returned to that same quiet it had before all of this started. But it was not the same quiet. Not really. It carried weight now, awareness, like everyone out there understood something had shifted, even if they could not put it into words. And later that afternoon, as the light changed and stretched long across the floor inside, my phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter, the sharp vibration breaking through the stillness. And when I picked it up, the message was exactly what I expected: official tone, legal language, and notice of review, potential enforcement, the kind of document designed to reestablish control through process when direct action fails. And I read it once, slowly, then set the phone back down without responding, because the truth was simple. They were now reacting to something that had already been completed, something they could not undo without stepping outside the very rules they claimed to enforce. And as the evening settled again, I walked back to the door one more time, standing just inside the threshold, looking at the clean lines of the steel from the interior side, the way it fits seamlessly into the structure of the house, like it had always been there, like it had always belonged. And I thought back to that first moment, the key that would not turn, the paper taped to the handle, the assumption that access could be taken and controlled by someone else. And I let my hand rest against the door again, feeling that same solid resistance, that same quiet certainty. And I realized something that had not been clear at the start. This was never about keeping them out. Not really. It was about redefining who had the right to decide. And as the last light of the day faded and the house settled into night, one thing became undeniable. Whatever they tried next, whatever letters they sent, whatever authority they claimed, it would all have to face the same reality. Access was no longer theirs to control. Not now. Not ever again. And systems like that do not just resist pressure, they outlast it. The next morning did not come with noise or confrontation. It came with something quieter, something heavier, the kind of stillness that settles after people realize the rules they relied on no longer apply the way they thought. And I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, staring at my phone as another message came through. This one different, not a warning, not a threat, but a notice of an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for that evening. The tone formal, urgent, like they were trying to regain control through procedure. And I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to feel the shift in their language, the difference between confidence and caution, and it was there, subtle but clear. And when the time came, I did not rush, I did not dress up the situation. I simply drove to the clubhouse like I had done before. The gravel lot crunching under my tires, the building looking the same, as always, neat, controlled, designed to project order. But inside, the air felt different, tighter, like everyone there was aware something had changed, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. And when I walked in, conversation stopped just for a second, not dramatic, just enough to register my presence. And I could see her at the front of the room, Victoria Hayes, standing behind the table, papers laid out in precise stacks, posture straight, expression composed. But her eyes moved differently now, not scanning for weakness, but measuring something she could not quite define. And I took a seat without saying a word, letting the silence stretch until she began. "We are here to address a serious compliance issue," she said, voice controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried before, and she started listing. Violations, structural concerns, unauthorized modifications, each phrase carefully chosen, but each one landing softer than she expected, because the room had already seen the door, they had already heard the outcome. And halfway through her explanation, one of the board members shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Have we reviewed the permits?" he asked. And that was the first crack, small but visible, and she paused, just long enough to show it, before responding. "The installation exceeds community guidelines," and I leaned forward slightly, placing my own folder on the table with a quiet, deliberate motion. The same folder I had shown before, organized, complete, undeniable, and I slid it toward the center, not aggressively, just enough for everyone to see. "All documentation is there," I said, calm, steady, and the room went quiet again as the nearest board member reached for it. Flipping through slowly, page by page, the soft sound of paper turning, filling the space where her authority used to dominate. And as he read, others leaned in, not to challenge, but to understand, and I watched their expressions shift, confusion giving way to realization, realization to acceptance, because facts do not argue, they settle. And when he finally looked up, he did not look at me first, he looked at her, and that said everything appears compliant. He said, simple, direct. And that was the moment the balance broke completely, not with noise, not with conflict, but with clarity, and Victoria straightened slightly, trying to recover. "The association still reserves the right to enforce standards," she said, but the words did not carry the same weight anymore, because standards only matter when they are applied within the law, and the law was no longer on her side. And I stood then, not abruptly, just with purpose, gathering my folder, looking around the room at the faces that had once deferred to her without question. And I spoke once more, not loud, not dramatic, just clear. "You try to control access to something you do not own," I said, meeting her gaze for a brief second before continuing. "Now access is defined by something you cannot override." And I did not wait for a response, because there was none that could change what had already been established. And